Some miracles don't arrive with flashing lights or doctors shouting orders. Some miracles roll quietly into forgotten places and wait for the right kind of heart to notice them. And on an ordinary Thursday morning under the sharp California sun, that miracle came disguised as a luxury car pulling into the cracked concrete yard of a dying garage in San Diego, a place where hope usually leaked out faster than engine oil. And Daniel Carter, a poor mechanic with grease-stained hands and tired eyes, looked up from beneath a rusted pickup truck and whispered to himself, "That car doesn't belong here," not knowing that this single moment would unlock 11 years of buried guilt, silent promises, and a child the world had already told to stop dreaming. Before this story unfolds, before tears fall and hope learns to walk again, take a moment to subscribe to our channel Kindness True Stories, like this video, and leave a comment below, because stories like this remind us that humanity still exists in the smallest corners of the world. The morning was bright and unforgiving, sunlight pouring through broken roof panels as Daniel wiped sweat from his brow and slid out from under the truck, the smell of oil and metal clinging to him like a second skin, when the sleek black car stopped just inches from his tool bench, its polished surface reflecting a life he had never known. And then the door opened slowly, as if even the car itself was unsure it should be there. A tall woman stepped out, dressed simply but expensively, sunglasses hiding eyes that had cried more than the world could imagine. And beside her, a young girl was carefully lifted into a wheelchair by a suited driver, the girl's legs thin and still, her hands gripping the armrests as if the chair was both a prison and a shield. And Daniel felt something tighten in his chest because he had seen that look before, the look of a child pretending not to hope. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice controlled but fragile. "Are you Daniel Carter?" And he nodded slowly, confused, wiping his hands on a rag as he replied, "That's me, ma'am. If you're looking for a tow or a repair, I'm not sure this place is what you want." And the woman almost smiled at that, a sad curve of the lips as she answered, "I'm not here for the car. I'm here for you," which made Daniel stiffen, years of keeping his head down making him uneasy with attention, especially from someone like her. The girl watched him quietly, her dark eyes curious, intelligent, older than her small body suggested, and when Daniel crouched slightly to meet her eye level, he said, gently, "Hey there, what's your name?" And she hesitated before answering. "Emily," her voice soft but steady, and he smiled despite himself. "That's a good name," to which she replied, almost testing him. "My uncle used to say that, too." And something inside Daniel cracked open, because his own brother's face flashed in his mind, like a ghost under daylight. The woman removed her sunglasses then, revealing eyes red from sleepless nights, and said, "I'm Victoria Reynolds," a name that meant nothing to Daniel but meant everything to the world, beyond his garage, "and Emily is my daughter." And Daniel nodded respectfully, still unsure why a billionaire tech magnate was standing in front of him while pigeons cooed on. Power lines overhead and distant traffic hummed like normal life going on without them. "I was told you fixed a man's hands once," Victoria continued, her voice lowering. "A construction worker who couldn't work again after an accident. Doctors said surgery was the only option. But somehow, after spending time here, he went back to work." And Daniel's jaw tightened as he shook his head. "I didn't fix him. I just helped him listen to his body." But Victoria stepped closer, desperation slipping through her composed exterior as she said, "I've paid for the best doctors in the world. Daniel, the best hospitals, experimental treatments, private specialists, and every single one of them told my daughter she would never walk again." And Emily looked away at those words, her fingers tightening on the wheelchair armrest as if bracing for a familiar pain. Daniel knelt fully now, ignoring the ache in his knees, and spoke directly to Emily. "Do you want to walk?" And she looked back at him, surprised by the simplicity of the question, then nodded once and said, "Yes, but I don't want people to feel sorry for me anymore." And Daniel felt his throat tighten as he replied softly, "That's fair," then stood slowly, meeting Victoria's eyes. "Ma'am, I'm not a doctor. I don't do miracles." And Victoria whispered, "I don't need a miracle. I need someone who sees my daughter as more than a diagnosis." And those words hit him harder than any wrench ever had, because 11 years ago, standing beside a hospital bed, His dying brother had grabbed his wrist and said, "Promise me you won't let them give up on kids like her." A promise Daniel had kept in silence. One broken-down car and one desperate person at a time. The sun climbed higher, light flooding the garage as Daniel exhaled slowly and said, "I can't promise anything," and Victoria replied immediately, "I don't want promises, I want honesty." And Daniel looked down at Emily again and said, "Then we start with listening, not machines, not money, just listening." And Emily's lips trembled into the smallest smile she had worn in years. As birds scattered across the blue sky and the smell of hot asphalt filled the air, Daniel rolled Emily gently into the shade of the garage, unaware that this single act, this quiet moment in daylight, would soon bring a powerful woman to her knees in tears and challenge everything the world believed about disability, wealth, and kindness, because sometimes hope doesn't arrive in hospitals. Sometimes it waits in places the rich never look, under a broken roof, in the hands of a man who never stopped believing in promises made to the dead. The sun was now higher in the sky, pouring through the open garage. Dora's dust floated, in the light like tiny memories, refusing to settle. And Daniel pushed aside an old rolling chair, clearing space near a worn wooden bench as Emily watched every movement with careful attention, her eyes absorbing details the way children do when they sense something important is about to happen. And Victoria stood near the entrance, arms folded tightly not against the breeze, but against fear she had carried for years. And Daniel finally broke the silence, saying, "Emily, before anyone ever told you that you couldn't walk, do you remember how it felt to stand?" And Emily blinked, surprised, then nodded slowly and said, "I remember my feet felt warm on the floor, like the ground was holding me." And Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second, as if committing those words to memory, then replied, "That's not something your body forgets easily." And Victoria stepped forward, her voice sharp with restrained emotion. Every specialist said nerve damage, irreversible, permanent, and Daniel looked at her calmly and said, "Doctors read reports, I listened to people," which made Victoria fall silent, realizing how rare it was for anyone to speak to her without fear or flattery. Daniel rolled a small stool over and sat in front of Emily, placing his hands gently on her knees but not pressing, not testing, just resting them there as if greeting an old friend. And he said softly, "Does it hurt here?" And Emily shook her head. "No." Then he moved his hands slightly. "Here?" And she hesitated, then whispered, "A little." And Victoria sucked in a breath as Daniel nodded. "Good. Pain means something is still talking." And Emily frowned. "Talking?" And he smiled. "Your body. It whispers before it shouts." And Emily thought about that as the sounds of traffic outside blended with the distant cries of seagulls, reminding them all that life was still moving forward. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice trembling. "Daniel, I've donated millions to research. I've built wings in hospitals. I would give everything I own if it meant my daughter could just stand up once." And Daniel replied without looking at her, "Sometimes giving everything means stepping back." And that hit Victoria harder than any rejection ever had, because she had spent her whole life fixing problems with money, and this was something money couldn't touch. Daniel asked Emily, "Do you trust me?" And she looked up at him, searching his face, then glanced at her mother, whose eyes were glassy with fear, and Emily said quietly, "I think so." And Daniel nodded. "That's enough for today?" Which surprised Victoria. "That's it?" And Daniel stood, stretching his back. "Healing isn't a show. We don't rush it for applause." And Emily smiled faintly at that, liking the way he spoke as if time answered to him. As noon approached, Daniel brought out 2 old folding chairs and offered water, and they sat together under the shade, the garage suddenly feeling less like a workplace and more like a place where stories gathered. And Victoria finally asked the question she had been holding since she arrived. "Why do you do this?" And Daniel stared at his hands, scarred and worn, then said, "My younger brother, Michael, he was a physical therapist. Before an accident took his life." And Emily leaned forward, listening closely as Daniel continued. "He believed the body wasn't broken, just misunderstood. And when he was dying, he made me promise I wouldn't let that belief die with him." And Victoria's composure finally cracked, as tears spilled freely, Not elegant or controlled, just raw grief meeting another kind of loss. And she whispered, "All this time, I thought I was fighting alone." And Daniel looked at her and said, "You weren't? You just didn't know where to look." After a short break, Daniel rolled Emily back toward the bench and said, "We're not standing today." And Emily looked disappointed, but nodded. "Okay," and Daniel smiled gently. "But we are waking something up." And he guided her through simple movements. Small shifts, toes curling, knees tensing, nothing dramatic. But Emily's face lit up when she felt a flicker she hadn't felt in years. "I felt that," she said quickly, afraid it might disappear, and Daniel nodded calmly. "That's your body saying hello." And Victoria covered her mouth, tears falling again as hope cautiously re-entered her heart. Not bursting in, but stepping softly like it didn't want to scare anyone away. Hours passed unnoticed as sunlight shifted, shadows stretching across the floor. And when it was time to leave, Emily looked up at Daniel and asked, "Can we come back tomorrow?" And Daniel answered without hesitation, "If you want to." And Emily smiled wider than she had all day, turning to her mother, "Mom, I want to." And Victoria nodded, unable to speak. Because for the first time in years, tomorrow didn't feel like another appointment filled with disappointment. It felt like a possibility. As the luxury car pulled away from the garage, disappearing into the brightness of the San Diego afternoon, Daniel stood alone again, listening to the quiet return. But this time it felt different, heavier and lighter all at once. Because something had begun, something fragile and powerful. And he whispered toward the empty air, "I'm keeping the promise." Michael, unaware that the world would soon be watching, and that the quiet work done in daylight shadows would soon shake lives far beyond this forgotten garage. The next morning arrived warmer than the last, sunlight spilling across the quiet street, as if the day itself was curious about what would happen next. And Daniel was already at the garage before the birds settled on the wires, sweeping the floor and opening every door and window to let the light in. Because something inside him told him this day mattered. And when the familiar black luxury car appeared again at the edge of the lot, his chest tightened with a mix of responsibility and hope. Emily was already smiling when she saw him, a real smile this time, not the polite kind, and she said, "You're early," and Daniel replied with a grin, "So are you," while Victoria watched them, noticing how her daughter's shoulders were relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. Inside the garage, the air felt different, charged, as Daniel rolled Emily into position and knelt in front of her, saying, "Tell me how your legs feel today." And Emily closed her eyes for a moment, concentrating, then said, tingly, "Like they're awake," and Daniel nodded slowly. "Good. That means yesterday didn't scare them," and Victoria laughed softly through nerves. "I've never heard anyone talk about legs like they're people," and Daniel replied, "They are. They remember being ignored." He positioned a sturdy wooden rail against the bench and explained calmly, "We're not standing yet. We're just reminding your body what upright feels like." And Emily looked at him seriously. "What if I fall?" And Daniel met her eyes. "Then I'll catch you, and if I don't, the floor will, and neither one of us will be angry." And that simple promise eased something deep inside her. With careful movements, he guided her forward, her hands gripping the rail as sunlight wrapped around her face. And Victoria's breath caught as Emily's feet pressed flat against the ground, her knees trembling visibly, and Emily whispered, "It feels strange." And Daniel said softly, "Strange is good. Strange means new messages are being sent." Seconds stretched into eternity as Emily held that position, not standing, not sitting, just hovering between who she had been told she was and who she might become. And then her knees buckled slightly, and Daniel steadied her immediately. "That's enough for now," he said firmly, and Emily exhaled, half disappointed, half proud. "I almost did it," and Daniel smiled. "You did exactly what you needed to do." Victoria had to turn away then, pressing her hand to her mouth as tears streamed freely, because she had seen her daughter in countless therapy rooms, but never like this, never treated with patience instead of pressure, faith instead of fear. Later, as they rested, Victoria finally asked, "Why haven't others tried this?" And Daniel answered honestly, "Because it doesn't look impressive. There are no machines, no charts to sell hope, just time and listening. And Victoria nodded slowly, realizing how often she had mistaken complexity for truth. Over the next hours, Daniel told Emily stories not about healing, but about ordinary things. About fixing engines and how every broken part had a purpose. And Emily listened closely, asking questions, laughing when he teased himself. And each laugh felt like another step forward, invisible but real. When the time came to leave, Emily surprised them both by saying, "Can I try once more before we go?" And Daniel studied her face, seeing determination instead of desperation, and said, "One more, and this time." When he guided her forward, something different happened. Her legs shook violently, her jaw clenched, and for a split second, Emily was upright, fully upright, standing on her own feet, and Victoria screamed, "Emily!" reaching out, but Daniel shouted calmly, "Let her be." And then just as quickly, Emily collapsed back into the chair, breathless and stunned, silence filling the garage. Before Emily burst into laughter, breathless and wild, "Mom!" I stood, and Victoria fell to her knees, sobbing openly now, her hands shaking as she said over and over, thank you, not to Daniel, not to God, but to the moment itself." Daniel knelt beside Emily and said quietly, "Remember this feeling, not the standing, the courage?" And Emily nodded seriously, understanding that this was only the beginning. Outside, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like proof of time passing. And as the car drove away again, Daniel leaned against the workbench, exhausted, overwhelmed, knowing that word would spread, knowing people would come, knowing the world would demand explanations. But none of that mattered as much as one child learning that her body hadn't betrayed her after all. That night, Victoria sat beside Emily's bed, holding her hand as Emily whispered, "Mom, do you think I'll walk?" And Victoria answered honestly for the first time, "I don't know, but I know we won't stop believing." And miles away, Daniel stood alone in the garage, looking at the empty rail bathed in moonlight through the open door, whispering again, "We're getting there." Michael, unaware that the final step would demand a sacrifice none of them were prepared for, and that tomorrow would change everything they thought they understood about miracles, power, and love. The final morning began like any other, bright and ordinary. The kind of day that never warns you it's about to change lives forever, and Daniel felt it in his bones before the sun fully rose, a quiet heaviness mixed with peace as he opened the garage for what he didn't know would be the last time things stayed simple. The black car arrived again, but this time it didn't come alone. Cameras followed at a distance, whispers already spreading through the air, and Victoria noticed them immediately, her jaw tightening as she said, "They found us." And Daniel replied calmly, "Let them watch. Truth doesn't hide," while Emily looked nervous, gripping her mother's hand and asking, "Will this ruin it?" And Daniel knelt beside her and said gently, "Nothing real can be ruined by being seen." Inside the garage, daylight flooded every corner, as if the space itself was ready to witness something final. And Daniel set the rail again, slower this time, more deliberate. And he looked at Victoria and said, "Today I won't touch her unless she asks," which made Victoria's heart pound with fear. But she nodded, trusting him completely now. Daniel turned to Emily and asked, "Are you scared?" And Emily answered honestly, "Yes," and he smiled softly. "Good, that means this matters." And when Emily placed her hands on the rail and leaned forward, the world seemed to hold its breath, the cameras forgotten, the sounds outside fading, and step by trembling step Emily pushed herself upright, her legs shaking violently but holding long enough for her to let go of the rail, just for a second, then another, and then she took a step, one small, imperfect step forward. And the garage erupted into gasps and sobs, Victoria collapsing again, crying harder than ever. My baby, as Emily stood there, crying and laughing at the same time, saying, I'm doing it, before finally sinking back into the chair, exhausted but victorious. The reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. How did you do this? Is this a miracle? Why didn't doctors succeed? And Daniel raised his hand and said firmly, This isn't a miracle. It's what happens when you don't give up on listening. And then he turned to Victoria and said words she would never forget. But now comes the hard part. Later that day, in the full light of afternoon, Victoria stood before the cameras alone, her voice steady but emotional, and announced, "I am shutting down one of my private rehabilitation centers." Gasps rippled through the crowd as she continued, "and redirecting those funds to create open-access healing spaces, based on patience, human connection, and dignity starting here, in this garage." And Daniel protested quietly, "I never asked for this," but Victoria looked at him and said, "You never asked for recognition. That's why you deserve it." The world reacted fast, praise and criticism clashing loudly, but inside the garage, something quieter and stronger took root, a place where people came not to be fixed, but to be understood. Weeks later, under the same bright San Diego sun, Emily took her first unassisted steps across the garage floor. Daniel standing back now, hands behind his back, smiling through tears, and Victoria watching with her, hand over her heart as Emily reached the other side and whispered, "Uncle Michael would be proud." And Daniel broke down then, years of silence finally releasing as he knelt and cried openly, not from pain but from promise fulfilled. As the day ended and the light softened, Emily walked to Daniel and hugged him tightly, saying, "You didn't just help me walk. You helped my mom breathe again." And Victoria nodded, tears in her eyes. "And you reminded me that humanity is richer than money." And Daniel looked around the once forgotten garage now filled with life and said quietly, "Kindness doesn't need permission. It just needs space." And somewhere in the world, someone watching this story would feel hope stand up inside them for the first time. Because miracles don't always look like magic. Sometimes they look like patience, courage, and one simple act of kindness that teaches hope how to walk again.